July 8, 1944, Northern Saipan. Private First Class Guy Louis Gabaldon, just 18 years old, stood barely 123 pounds. On this day, he walked toward a cave network where hundreds of Japanese soldiers and civilians were hiding. What followed became one of the most remarkable one-man efforts of the Pacific War. In a single day, this young Marine convinced more than 800 Japanese soldiers and civilians to lay down their arms. By the end of the war, he would be credited with bringing in around 2,500 prisoners, men, women, and children, who had been taught that surrender meant certain torture or death. The outcome on Saipan was not written in firepower or battle plans, but in the gap between propaganda and reality. Civilians were told Americans were monsters, yet Gabaldon showed them something different, using his knowledge of Japanese language and culture to break through fear. Guy Gabaldon's path to Saipan began far from the Pacific, in the Boyle Heights neighborhood of East Los Angeles, 5,400 miles away. Born March 22, 1926, he was one of 7 children in a Mexican-American family struggling during the Great Depression. His life changed at age 12, when he went to live with the Nakano family, Japanese Americans who welcomed him into their home. For several years, Gabaldon became part of their household. He ate Japanese food, spoke the language at home, and learned the values of honor, family, and respect. Everything changed after December 7, 1941. Only months later, Executive Order 9066 forced the Nakano family, along with 120,000 other Japanese Americans, into internment camps. The Nakanos were relocated to Heart Mountain, Wyoming, one of the largest camps that held 14,000 Japanese Americans from 1942 to 1945. Gabaldon saw the family who had cared for him uprooted from their lives. At 17, he joined the U.S. Marines. His reasons were both patriotic and personal. He wanted to serve, and he wanted to use the language skills he had gained from his foster family. His Japanese was conversational, not perfect, but it had been learned through real life, not textbooks. By March 1944, Gabaldon was serving with Headquarters and Service Company 2nd Marine, 2nd Marine Division. His role as scout and observer would soon place him at the center of Operation Forager, the invasion of the Mariana Islands. On Saipan, about 30,000 Japanese soldiers and an unknown number of civilians waited. The intelligence briefings painted a grim picture. Japanese propaganda had prepared families for mass death. Parents were issued grenades. Children were told to kill Americans. Mothers were warned that Marines were criminals who would torture and brutalize captives. Posters and leaflets described Americans as devils who would assault women and eat children. The stage was set for a bloodbath. On June 15, 1944, Gabaldon landed with the invasion force. The fight for Saipan raged until July 9th. Civilians and soldiers were pushed steadily north. Unlike most Marines, Gabaldon took matters into his own hands. According to Marine Corps records and his Navy Cross citation, he repeatedly left camp on his own at night, against direct orders. Alone, he would approach caves and bunkers, speaking in Japanese. He assured those inside that he came unarmed, that they would not be harmed, and that Americans would treat them fairly. His first attempt succeeded early in the campaign. Sitting outside a cave, he spoke casually about food, safety, and the treatment of prisoners. Hours later, Japanese soldiers stepped out and surrendered. Word of this unusual success spread. At first, officers doubted him. Most military interpreters used bullhorns, shouting orders in formal Japanese. Gabaldon spoke differently, using the casual, everyday phrases and respectful tone he had learned at the Nakano family's dinner table. The turning point came July 8, 1944. American forces had cornered Japanese troops and civilians at the northern end of Saipan. Panic and despair had taken hold. Families were already throwing themselves off the cliffs that would later be known as Suicide Cliff and Banzai Cliff. Entire groups of civilians died in mass suicides, convinced the capture meant torture. That day, Gabaldon approached a large group hiding in caves and bunkers. The exact words he spoke were never officially recorded, but the results were undeniable. He returned with 87 prisoners, soldiers, and civilians, surrendering to a single Marine. Military intelligence officers later verified these events, and his actions were even recognized on the national television program This Is Your Life in 1957. The scale of Gabaldon's accomplishments led to recognition, but also doubts. Captain John Schwab recommended him for the Medal of Honor on July 15, 1944, only days after his largest surrender. General Holland Smith, however, downgraded the award, and Gabaldon instead received the Navy Cross. His official citation described how he repeatedly entered caves, pillboxes, and jungle hideouts alone, often under enemy fire, capturing more than 1,000 Japanese troops and civilians. Not everyone agreed on the details. Lieutenant Robert B. Sheeks, a Marine Japanese language officer on Saipan, later questioned some of Gabaldon's claims, describing him as a self-promoter. Because most of his actions happened at night without witnesses, exact numbers will never be proven beyond doubt. What is certain is the backdrop against which his actions took place. The Battle of Saipan was one of the Pacific's bloodiest. Over 3,000 Americans died. Virtually all 30,000 Japanese troops were killed. An estimated 22,000 civilians also lost their lives, many by suicide. Whole families jumped off cliffs together. Mothers killed their children before killing themselves. The brutality was fueled by years of propaganda. In this setting, Gabaldon's ability to convince anyone to surrender was extraordinary. Each life he saved was one less lost to the cycle of fear and violence. Later in the campaign, Gabaldon was shot and wounded during one of his solo missions. Even so, records state he kept working until he was evacuated for treatment. After recovering, he returned to action and served in later Pacific battles, though none matched what he achieved on Saipan. By war's end, his official count stood at over 1,000 captured, with most sources putting the total closer to 1,500. Initially awarded the Silver Star, his medal was later upgraded to the Navy Cross. His story remains one of the most unusual and debated episodes in Marine Corps history. In November 23, 1960, Guy Gabaldon's Silver Star was upgraded to the Navy Cross. This made it the highest decoration ever awarded to a Marine of Mexican descent during World War II. The Navy Cross is second only to the Medal of Honor in the Navy and Marine Corps, reserved for extraordinary valor. For decades, campaigns pushed to have Gabaldon's Navy Cross upgraded again to the Medal of Honor. Los Angeles Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa, the Hispanic Medal of Honor Society, and several congressional leaders supported the effort. Each attempt was rejected, with officials citing strict time limits on reconsidering wartime awards. Some observers, however, believe hesitation also came from discomfort with Gabaldon's unusual methods of warfare. The debate was never just about medals. Some historians doubted whether a single Marine could achieve the captures Gabaldon claimed. Others noted the challenge of verifying his results, since much of his work was done alone at night. Yet Marine Corps intelligence officers did confirm his achievements, and the Navy Cross citation officially recognizes his record. In 1960, Hollywood released Hell to Eternity, a film supposedly based on his life. But instead of honoring his real background, the studio cast Jeffrey Hunter, a tall, blue-eyed actor, as Gabaldon. This erased his Mexican-American identity. The movie turned his careful negotiations into gunfights, his cultural knowledge into American bravado. Gabaldon himself expressed disappointment, saying the film ignored the true nature of his story. The Hollywood version replaced patience with violence, shifting the focus from cultural understanding to standard war hero action. These distortions shaped public opinion of his story for years. 3 decades later, in 1990, Gabaldon told his own story in an autobiography titled Saipan, Suicide Island, later republished as America Betrayed. Historians caution that memoirs written long after the events can blur memory with hindsight, but the book offers Gabaldon's personal account. He explained that his success came not from intimidation, but from treating Japanese soldiers and civilians as human beings. He relied on cultural understanding as much as language. His method was patience, sometimes sitting for hours outside caves speaking about food, family, and safety, until fear gave way to trust. After the war, Gabaldon returned to civilian life. He later moved back to Saipan, where he lived for 20 years running a fishing business. He married, raised 11 children, 9 of whom survived into adulthood, and spent decades speaking publicly about his wartime experiences. His message always emphasized cultural respect and the human side of conflict. On July 7, 2006, Los Angeles Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa honored Gabaldon at City Hall, celebrating his contributions to American military history. Just weeks later, on August 31, 2006, Gabaldon passed away from heart disease in Old Town, Florida, at age 80. He was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. Gabaldon's adoptive brother, Lane Nakano, also served during the war. Nakano fought in the famed 442nd Regimental Combat Team, a unit composed almost entirely of Japanese-American soldiers. The 442nd became the most decorated unit of its size and length of service in U.S. history, earning 9,186 Purple Hearts and 21 Medals of Honor. While Gabaldon used his Japanese language skills to save lives in the Pacific, Nakano fought in Europe to prove the loyalty of Japanese Americans, even as their families remained imprisoned in internment camps back home. Both men lived through the war, and their bond endured throughout their lives. Nakano passed away on April 28, 2005. Their parallel stories reflect the contradictions of World War II, where discrimination at home existed alongside acts of heroism abroad. Although it is difficult to measure Gabaldon's direct impact on military doctrine, his work is cited as an early example of psychological operations. His ability to persuade through culture and communication became a model for later U.S. military training. Modern psychological operations schools continue to use his case to show how cultural knowledge can bring tactical advantages. While military manuals rarely mention him by name, the lessons drawn from his experience have influenced training for decades. His approach has proven just as relevant in modern wars. In Iraq and Afghanistan, American units with skilled interpreters who understood not just language but also local culture consistently reported better outcomes when engaging civilians. Gabaldon's principle, that cultural knowledge can be as powerful as firepower, remains a truth on today's battlefields. When historians place Gabaldon's achievements within the broader Pacific War, the scale becomes clear. The Battle of Saipan was one of the bloodiest, with Japanese military casualties exceeding 90%. Against that backdrop, convincing even small groups to surrender was extraordinary. Convincing more than 1,000 was nearly unbelievable. The noted historian Dr. Gordon W. Prange included Gabaldon's story in his studies of individual heroism. While he acknowledged that details are hard to verify, he pointed out that the Navy Cross itself confirms the essential truth of Gabaldon's success. The central achievement remains clear. Records confirm he captured well over 1,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians. Marine Corps records credit him with about 1,500 total, including a single-day record of 87 prisoners on July 8, 1944. His service lasted from June 15 to July 9, 1944, when he was wounded by machine gun fire late in the campaign. He left Saipan as a private first class, promoted during combat with a Navy Cross, a Purple Heart, and recognition in official U.S. military history. These statistics only tell part of the story. Each number represented a life saved. Japanese soldiers and civilians who returned home because one Marine chose persuasion over bloodshed. Gabaldon's work showed how a single man could defy wartime propaganda and prove that human understanding could succeed where violence failed. His methods shared key traits. First, he approached with apparent vulnerability, alone, unarmed, and non-threatening. This directly contradicted Japanese propaganda that portrayed Americans as brutal killers. His small frame, 5 feet 4 inches, 123 pounds, made him seem less intimidating than the monstrous image spread in wartime leaflets. Second, he spoke in natural, everyday Japanese, not the stiff formal speech found in phrasebooks. This created familiarity and trust. Third, he demonstrated relentless patience, often speaking for hours until fear gave way to willingness. These principles, vulnerability, cultural understanding, and patience, earned him the nickname the Pied Piper of Saipan. They remain a lesson for military strategy today. That respect and communication can achieve victories impossible by force alone. A fourth element of Gabaldon's method was dignity. He never demanded unconditional surrender. Instead, he explained surrender as a way for families to survive, to remain alive for Japan's future. By presenting it this way, he gave soldiers and civilians a path to surrender without feeling they had abandoned honor completely. To appreciate this achievement, it's necessary to understand the environment on Saipan. Japanese propaganda was relentless. Civilians were told that Americans would torture every captured man, rape every woman, and even eat children. Posters and broadcasts described Americans as cannibals who would desecrate Japanese bodies and erase their culture. Military police forced families toward cliffs, while officers handed out grenades to parents, urging them to kill their loved ones rather than allow capture. Suicide was portrayed as loyalty to the emperor. Against this atmosphere of fear, convincing anyone to surrender should have been impossible. Yet Gabaldon achieved it again and again. His very appearance contradicted the propaganda. A small young Marine speaking Japanese walking up to caves alone. He shattered the terrifying image civilians had been taught. By showing patience and proving with his actions that the propaganda was false, he created trust. Gabaldon's story offers lessons that remain relevant today. In wars where civilians are trapped between two sides, cultural understanding can save lives more effectively than firepower. His experience points to several principles. Language must be paired with cultural knowledge. Individual initiative can sometimes succeed where traditional military operations fail. Patience and respect can break down even the strongest walls of propaganda. Treating the enemy as future allies rather than permanent enemies can open unexpected doors. And at times a single person or a small team can succeed where entire units cannot. Some of these lessons were echoed in Iraq and Afghanistan. Units that invested in cultural training and language skills often reported better results when working with local civilians. Still, the military as a whole has struggled to fully apply Gabaldon's approach, often defaulting to conventional force and security measures. The question of proof has always surrounded Gabaldon's story. Lieutenant Robert B. Sheeks once described him as a relentless self-promoter, raising doubts about his accounts. Since Gabaldon often worked alone at night, there were rarely witnesses. But several facts support the core of his record. He was officially recognized with the Navy Cross, which represents formal U.S. military acknowledgement. In 1957, 3 Marine intelligence officers confirmed his capture numbers publicly. Marine Corps records from 1944 document his capture of 87 prisoners on July 8. His Japanese language ability is beyond dispute, as is the fact that many Japanese surrendered on Saipan, despite propaganda telling them otherwise. Even if every detail cannot be independently verified, the overall picture stands. Gabaldon persuaded large numbers of Japanese to surrender, and this is confirmed in military records and recognized with one of the nation's highest awards for valor. His achievement goes beyond military statistics. It shows the strength of cultural bridge building in the most extreme circumstances. His skill was not just language, it was understanding. He knew the Japanese concepts of honor, family, and shame, and he addressed soldiers and civilians through that shared cultural frame. This ability came from his unusual background, a Mexican-American raised in part by a Japanese-American family. What might have seemed like a disadvantage became his greatest strength. He could move between cultures in a way most interpreters trained by the military could not. His story challenges traditional military thinking that prioritizes firepower and technology above all. During the Battle of Saipan, one teenager with language skills saved more lives than entire battalions armed with superior weapons. His success shows how diversity within the military can be a true advantage. Gabaldon's legacy offers several lasting lessons. First, diversity strengthens military effectiveness. His heritage and upbringing gave him unique tools no standard training could provide. Second, unconventional methods can achieve conventional goals. Though he broke protocol by operating alone, he delivered results that standard operations could not. Third, treating enemies with respect instead of hostility can open opportunities that force would close. Fourth, individual courage can influence strategy. By saving about 1,500 lives, Gabaldon not only spared families but also demonstrated that mercy was possible even in the bloodiest fighting. This could have influenced Japanese views of Americans beyond Saipan. Still, history demands honesty. Not every part of his story can be proven beyond doubt. Some details may have been exaggerated in his later writings. The absence of witnesses, combined with his tendency to promote his story, complicates the record. His direct influence on military doctrine is not formally documented. These uncertainties don't erase his achievements, but they remind us that historical figures are complex, and their stories often grow with time. What is certain is remarkable enough. His Navy Cross, the Marine Corps records, and the confirmation by intelligence officers form the foundation of his story. The scale of what happened on Saipan gives even deeper meaning to his actions. Of around 30,000 Japanese military personnel, fewer than 1,000 survived. Of about 22,000 civilians, thousands died in mass suicides. American forces suffered more than 3,000 killed and 10,000 wounded. Against this grim backdrop, every single surrender Gabaldon secured was one less life lost. His 1,500 captures meant 1,500 people lived instead of died. People who returned to families, who took part in rebuilding Japan, who avoided becoming another statistic of war. That human dimension is the true heart of his legacy. Every capture Gabaldon made was not just a statistic. It was a life. Each prisoner was someone's son, husband, father, or brother. Each civilian persuaded to surrender meant a family kept whole. Children who would grow up with parents, communities that did not lose their members. The effects of those lives saved carried forward for generations. After the war, Guy Gabaldon's life moved in different directions. He served as a civilian interpreter during the occupation of Japan. Later, he returned to Saipan, where he lived for 20 years. There, he ran a fishing business and stayed connected to the island where he had once made history. His choice to live in Saipan speaks to a lasting bond with both the land and its people. Though there are no records of him reuniting with those he personally saved, his long stay on the island suggests he felt deeply tied to its past and its community. In later years, Gabaldon became an outspoken advocate for Hispanic recognition in American military history. He visited schools, spoke at veterans events, and addressed community gatherings. His talks often highlighted themes of cultural respect and the importance of individual initiative. Through these efforts, he helped bring wider attention to Hispanic contributions in U.S. military service. When Gabaldon passed away, his burial at Arlington National Cemetery marked formal recognition of his service. Arlington's strict eligibility rules mean his interment there confirmed that the military officially acknowledged his extraordinary contributions. His gravesite has since become a place of remembrance for those interested in Latino military history and in unconventional approaches to war. Several organizations have honored his memory. Hispanic veterans groups regard him as an example of Latino excellence in combat service. Marine Corps units studying psychological operations have examined his techniques. Military language training programs often use his case to show the tactical importance of cultural and linguistic skills. Yet unlike some war heroes, Gabaldon has no ship named in his honor, no major memorial, and no permanent museum exhibit. Outside of military history circles, his story remains far less known. This lack of recognition may reflect unease with his unorthodox methods, or lingering doubts about the scale of his achievements. Still, in today's world of asymmetric conflicts, his story is more relevant than ever. Wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria have proven that victory requires more than firepower. Success often depends on understanding local cultures, gaining civilian trust, and offering alternatives to violence. Many principles found in modern counterinsurgency doctrine, language skills, cultural awareness, patient engagement, and treating enemies as possible allies, were demonstrated by Gabaldon decades earlier on Saipan. Yet even now, military institutions struggle to apply these lessons consistently. Language instruction remains limited, cultural awareness shallow, and conventional combat operations often take priority over patient engagement. Gabaldon's example shows what is possible, but much remains unrealized. Central to his success was his grasp of Japanese concepts of honor. He did not demand shameful surrender. Instead, he framed surrender as a way to protect families, to survive for the sake of Japan's future. This allowed soldiers and civilians to choose life without abandoning their sense of dignity. His ability to work with, rather than against, the Japanese honor system created opportunities for surrender that traditional military thinking would have missed. His personal honesty is also important to note. Working alone without witnesses, he could have exaggerated his record without being challenged. That Marine Corps intelligence officers later verified his claims suggest his accounts were fundamentally truthful, even if some details grew in later retellings. Guy Louis Gabaldon died having saved around 1,500 enemy lives, an achievement built on cultural knowledge, individual courage, and persistence. His Navy Cross citation formally recognizes his heroism. His legacy shows that the greatest heroes of war are not always those who kill the most enemies, but sometimes those who save the most lives. The boy from Boyle Heights who learned Japanese from his foster family became a Marine who prevented massacres on Saipan. His transformation from troubled youth to decorated war hero to advocate for Hispanic recognition is a distinctly American story. A multicultural background became a battlefield asset. His personal initiative produced extraordinary results. His later life was dedicated to passing on lessons about cultural respect and human dignity. While some controversies remain, such as unverified details, possible embellishments in his memoirs, and skepticism about certain claims, the essential truth stands firm. His Navy Cross Marine Corps documentation and intelligence officer confirmations validate his extraordinary achievement. The numbers from Saipan highlight what he accomplished. Of about 30,000 Japanese soldiers on the island, fewer than 1,000 survived. Of about 22,000 civilians, thousands died in mass suicides. American forces lost more than 3,000 killed and suffered 10,000 wounded. Against this scale of destruction, Gabaldon's 1/500 captures meant 1/500 fewer deaths. Each of those people returned home alive rather than being lost to the war. This is what makes his legacy so powerful. He was not a conventional warrior defined by enemies killed. He was a bridge builder who saved enemy lives through persuasion. He was not a towering figure of brute force, but a small Marine who achieved results through cultural understanding. He was not a typical interpreter demanding surrender, but a negotiator who offered dignity in defeat. His story demonstrates that America's strength comes not only from weapons, but also from diversity, the unique skills created by multicultural backgrounds. A Mexican-American raised partly by Japanese Americans became the Marine most capable of convincing Japanese soldiers and civilians to surrender. The nickname Pied Piper of Saipan was not a myth. It was earned fact. On an island where fear and propaganda drove thousands to suicide, one Marine's steady voice in familiar language persuaded 1,500 people to choose life instead of death. Guy Gabaldon proved that even in war's darkest hours, cultural understanding and individual initiative can achieve what violence cannot. His legacy is not just measured in capture numbers, but in lives saved and lessons left behind. In the harsh math of combat, he chose addition, adding lives spared over subtraction through destruction. That legacy, verified by records, recognized with a Navy Cross, and remembered in military history, stands as proof of an extraordinary kind of heroism. On Saipan in 1944, Guy Gabaldon saved more enemy lives than perhaps any other American soldier in history. The boy from Boyle Heights became a Marine hero not through firepower, but through cultural understanding that turned enemies into survivors. That truth remains his lasting legacy.